They came back to the past with gloves in their pockets and doubt in their eyes. 70 years had crusted over the mountains like old ice. Memory had become rumor, and rumor had become myth. The new folder, a single, coffee-stained file found under a retired investigator's desk, promised nothing more than a few blurred photos and a typed note. Something moved them. At dusk the team pitched their tents where the original camp might have been. A thin wind stitched the pines to the sky. They followed the ghost-trodden route on a battered map, and beneath a slab of shale found a sliver of metal no larger than a fingernail, grooved oddly smooth and stamped with a mark that matched the faint symbol in the old folder. It did not belong to any boot or pull. It suggested manufacture, intent. As night bled into white-blue cold, the lead researcher traced a timeline from fragments and frostbite reports, aligning the new shard with a short window the original inquiry had dismissed. A theory reassembled itself like a broken compass, a sudden, unnatural noise. A panic as if the mountain inhaled, people driven from warmth into the teeth of weather. But there was also the whisper in the recording, a faint, metallic echo cut into the static, a syllable that didn't belong to wind or human throat. When slowed, it hinted at something deliberate, a signal or machine we had not considered. The team argued, then fell silent. Outside, shadows stretched long and patient. The shard glinted under the lantern like a promise. If the mountain had been a stage, someone, or something, had chosen their actors carefully. The new evidence did not solve the night. It sharpened the questions, turning the unknown from a blank wall into a doorway whose hinges still creaked. In the watchful hush that followed, each of them felt the same small, private certainty. Reopening the past had woken something that preferred to remain quiet. They called it a simple training trek in 1959. 9 bright packs threading a winter throat of the Ural, laughter muffled by wool and the close white of snow. What they left behind was a torn tent, flayed like an open mouth, and footprints that ran away from warmth and order into the raw geometry of the slope. Searchers found bodies scattered like punctuation, some curled in the hush of frost, others stripped of boots and seams of clothing. Faces turned to a sky that had offered no answer. At the ruined campsite the air still remembered a night of urgency. The tent had been cut from the inside, the fabric sliced as if by hands that knew how to escape. Some of the dead bore bruises that spoke of pressure and blunt force. Others showed no outward wound at all, as if their bones had been told to fail without argument. The official records offered explanations in clipped sentences: hypothermia, panic, an avalanche that never quite fit the topography, while families and towns murmured about things reason could not hold. In the years that followed, the past collected stories like frost. Each winter produced a new rumor, a distant light, a metallic sound, a man claiming to have heard voices where only wine should be. People patched these fragments into theories. Silence broken by military tests, the mountain's breath of infrasound, animal dread, or something human and cruel. None of them sat comfortably with each other. Each theory made the edges of the other sharper, and the edges refused to meet. Tonight, standing where footprints still remembered weight, an investigator traced the same torn seam in the tent's memory and felt the old confusion swell again. The evidence was intact only in its ability to frustrate. What remained, finally, was not a single truth but the shape of absence, a hollow that had been filled with stories, and would, for as long as people listened, remain dangerously, beautifully unexplained. They called it the dossier before they had finished poring over its edges, a stack of declassified pages that smelled faintly of old smoke and bureaucracy. Typed reports, stamped and redacted, offered dry notations about a night the original inquiry had labeled closed. But between the formal sentences a pattern thinned into view, mentions of a transient signal, an equipment test logged in a remote range, a single line crossed out and rewritten. Those pages were circumstantial, persuasive only when braided with other threads, yet they changed what the team allowed itself to imagine. Next came the modeling. A young climatologist fed the pass as slope into a lattice of modern avalanche simulations, while another ran acoustic maps for infrasound. The models predicted a brief, almost surgical window, a gust pattern that could, under precise conditions, lift and pull rather than bury. It was a prediction born of math and margin, not eyewitnesses, circumstantial again, but it produced a map, a minute-by-minute possibility that the old investigators had never had. Then the direct evidence arrived, blunt and stubborn. Photographs from a forgotten photographer, grainy, half-buried frames, revealed a metallic glint by a cairn, an object the size of a palm half swallowed by snow. A forensic team, using techniques not available in 1959, re-examined the tissue samples and trauma reports. The reanalysis produced contradictions, internal injuries inconsistent with simple blunt trauma, trace elements in hair and nails that suggested a manufactured alloy, and in a sealed evidence bag, a sliver of metal, grooved, milled, stamped with a tiny, almost ceremonial mark, waited to be retested. These were direct facts that could be held up to light. Witnesses, old and reluctant, were coaxed from silence. Re-interviews turned memories that had ossified into rumor into a chorus of small, precise recollections, a low hum the night before, a convoy of lights on a distant ridge, a man in a coat who left before dawn and did not return. Their testimonies blurred the line between their certainty and the passing of years. They were both direct in what they said and circumstantial in how those words fit with the documents and the models. Radiological assays returned numbers too low to make headlines yet too strange to dismiss, trace isotopes that suggested proximity to specialized equipment. Scientists argued in the lab, splitting hairs over contamination and chain of custody. Lawyers argued in the hallway. The community argued in coffee shops and comment threads. Every answer produced a new folding of uncertainty. The climax came not as a revelation, but as a choreography. The models narrowed a 10-minute interval. The documents hinted at an authorized test in that window. The photographs placed an object at the scene. The shard's metallurgy implied manufacture. The witnesses remembered the hum. Standing in the snow, the team played the sequence aloud, voice by voice, until the past formed a plausible scene, a machine, a signal, a panic, the human instinct to flee warmth. Even then, the story did not end. Direct pieces fit into a frame of circumstantial patterns and left gaps where no piece would go. The new evidence did not hand them an answer so much as recast the question with surgical clarity. Someone had done something precise, and the mountain had kept its counsel. The investigators left the pass with folders thicker, certainty thinner, and a single, unnerving prediction lodged like a stone, that the more we uncover, the more the night wants to close itself again. They called it the dossier because nothing about it claimed to be definitive. Between brittle pages of declassified reports, ink-redacted margins annotated in a hand that had learned to be cautious, lay the first whisper of a different story. An equipment test logged at an outpost miles from the pass, a curt note about anomalous acoustic readings a line later scratched out. These documents were circumstantial by nature, official, persuasive in tone, but only a thread without the rest of the weave. The lattice of proof built itself slowly, like the careful geometry of an avalanche model. A young physicist fed decades of weather records and slope data into high-resolution simulations. The results sketched a 10-minute window where wind, temperature inversion, and a narrow acoustic pulse could combine to produce an unsteady lift across a ridge. The model did not say someone caused it. It offered possibility, a map of how the mountain might behave under exacting conditions. Circumstantial again, but it turned rumor into a timetable. Then came the facts that could be touched. Grainy photographs surfaced from a private archive, a pale glint half buried in snow, an object the size of a glove with machined edges. In an evidence locker, a sliver of metal, milled, grooved, stamped with an almost ornamental mark, waited. Forensic reanalysis of preserved tissue reports, using techniques that had not existed in 1959, revealed patterns that did not sit comfortably with blunt trauma alone. Internal hemorrhaging inconsistent with falling or trampling. Microfractures that suggested sudden compression from within. Trace analysis of hair and nails showed alloy residues not native to mountaineering equipment. These were direct, physical, and stubborn in the light. Witness re-interview supplied the human cadence. Old hunters, a retired engineer, a woman who had once skied the ridge as a child, their memories were frayed but specific. The engineer remembered a low, mechanical hum the week before the trek. The woman recalled lights moving in a deliberate sweep along the distant skyline. Each testimony was direct speech but circumstantial in import, a puzzle piece that only made sense when laid against the models and the dossier. Radiological assays returned numbers that refused easy headlines, traces too slight to claim contamination, too odd to dismiss. Scientists argued about contamination and chain of custody. Lawyers read the margin notes. The shard's metallurgy implied manufacture, not accident. The models suggested a precise interval. The documents hinted at authorization for a test in that slot. The witnesses remembered a hum. The trauma analysis insisted on sudden, unusual forces. In the bitter clarity of the lab, the team staged the sequence. They aligned the 10-minute window the model produced with the test log S timestamp and the photograph's shadow. They read the witnesses' statements aloud while a speaker reproduced a reconstructed acoustic pulse derived from the dossier's spectral notes. The playback was not a ghost. It was a machine of sound, low and insistent, and in the room it provoked a physical flinch, the same involuntary recoil the pathologist had noted in a survivor's reflexes. The climax was not revelation, but convergence. Direct and circumstantial braided into a plausible scene, a manufactured signal, a transient aerodynamic effect, panic, and human flight into a merciless dark. Yet plausibility is not proof. The pass yielded a new shape of uncertainty, narrower, sharper, more dangerous for its clarity. They left with folders heavier and answers lighter, and a single, uncomfortable prediction lodged under their ribs. The more precisely we map the past, the more doors we find that swing inward, into rooms that refuse to be emptied. They set their watches to the pass's old, frozen hour and read aloud the new reconstruction as if it were a prayer. The timeline was not certainty but a sharpened hypothesis, a stitchwork of logs, models, photographs, and witness memory. When read slowly, it became a small, terrible story. 2140 to 2230 the hikers make camp. Tent is pitched. Fire is small. No unusual notes in any original diary. This window is firm, supported by multiple source timestamps, and offers the last comfortable human moment. 2230, 030 routine checks. Laughter distant in the wind. Later testimony places a transient noise on the ridge, but is vague. Models show normal whine patterns. Nothing in the data forces alarm. Uncertainty remains wide. 030, 150 anomalies begin to cluster. A declassified log records and equipment test at a remote range with a timestamp overlapping this period. Acoustic simulations later show a narrow resonance could be produced under those conditions, but only if temperature inversion and gust align perfectly. Circumstantial threads begin to braid. 1:52 2 o'clock photographs from a private archive capture. At this margin, a pale glint near a cairn. Forensic scans of the shard recovered there date its manufacture to mid-century methods. Witness re-interview recalls a distant, low hum the same night. The circle tightens. Direct evidence appears at the edges. 2 o'clock, 2:06 critical window, minute by minute. 2 o'clock. Models indicate a brief pressure inversion forming along the ridge. 2:01. Acoustic log from the outpost shows a transient pulse recorded and time-stamped. 2:02. A witness later places lights sweeping the skyline. 2:03. The shard's metallurgy matches fragments found near one victim's gloves. 2:04. Forensic reanalysis reveals internal injuries consistent with sudden, inward compression at the moment of impact. 205. The tent is cut from the inside, a behavior consistent with rapid, panicked egress. 206. Photographic shadows align with witness testimony. The reconstructed pulse reproduced in the lab produces a palpable physical reaction in listeners. In these 6 minutes, doubt thins. The separate lines, the document's time stamp, the model's narrow prediction, the shard's presence, the trauma pattern, and the witness's timing converge into the same slender corridor of possibility. It is not proof, it is the most precise map they can draw. 206. Dawn, flight, confusion, body scattered. Medical notes show hypothermia patterns and paradoxical undressing. Some injuries remain stubbornly anomalous. Aftermath fills with silence, speculation, and the slow work of grief. They closed the folder, but the timeline stayed warm in their hands like a living thing. It had turned a long night into a sequence with a door, a 6-minute hinge in which agency and accident might have met. If the past could be pried open, it gave back not an answer, but the narrowing of a question. And with that, the grim prediction that the more precise our reconstructions grow, the more insistently the unknown will demand another door to hide behind. The lab smelled of disinfectant and old paper, a clean room where rumor met scalpel. For weeks the team fed the past into instruments that had never existed in 1959. High-resolution CT scans of archived reports, microchemical assays of hair and fabric, and biomechanical models that could translate bruises into forces. The results arrived like small, stubborn truths that refused to be tidy. Pathology reinterpreted what had once been inscrutable. The internal hemorrhaging on several bodies did not map to simple blows or falls. The pattern of microfractures and vascular rupture suggested sudden concentric compression, the sort that can occur when the chest is crushed inward or when the body experiences an intense rapid pressure change. It was a mechanical signature that demanded explanation beyond the ordinary. Hypothermia explains some things. The slow dimming of consciousness, the famous paradoxical undressing where victims shed clothing despite freezing temperatures, as the autonomic system misfires and warmth-seek becomes confusion. That thread fit the cold logic of the mountain. But it could not alone account for the timing and severity of internal trauma, nor for the way clothing was removed in some cases but left in others. Trauma analysis layered intent onto accident. Blunt force markings were inconsistent. Some injuries matched collision with hard objects. Others looked like sudden internal collapse without external cause. A biomechanical model reproduced the injuries when subjected to a brief, inward-directed compressive wave, not a shove or a fall, but a pressure impulse that could stun, rupture, and leave the exterior deceptively intact. Avalanche dynamics were rerun with modern simulations. The slopes that day did not meet the classic thresholds for a catastrophic slide. Instead, the models suggested a localized transient aerodynamic event could momentarily change the behavior of loose snow and air to produce a lifting and sloughing effect, enough to disorient and scatter, but not to bury. It was a refinement of possibility, not confirmation. Then the lab found traces that felt most uncanny, minuscule chemical residues and isotope signatures in hair and on fabric that pointed toward proximity to specialized equipment, not mass contamination, but faint fingerprints of manufacture. Radiological assays returned values to low for alarm yet odd in distribution, like an echo of something technical having been near the site. Alone, each result was a careful, circumscribed whisper. Together they sang a different song. A brief engineered pulse, acoustic or otherwise, could have produced a local pressure anomaly, causing internal compression injuries while also triggering panic and the physiological cascade of hypothermia and paradoxical undressing. Victims, startled and confused, cut their way out and fled into a night that needed no conspiracy to kill. In the hush after the tests, the team rehearsed their prediction aloud. The mountain had not been simply cruel or simply accidental. It had been an environment in which a precise, manufactured event and natural forces braided into catastrophe. The science did not point a finger though much as frame a moment, a thin, violent interval where human bodies met an engineered impulse and the old mystery sharpened into a new, urgent question: who had the tools to make the mountain speak, and why had they taught it to sing that night? Theories arrived like weather fronts, some thin and passing, others heavy and stubborn. The team set them in a row and watched how the new evidence buffeted each one, measuring which held and which fell away. Avalanche, the old favorite, lost ground. Modern slope simulations showed no catastrophic slide that night. The terrain and snowpack did not match the kind of burial that would explain scattered bodies or the internal injuries. Avalanche explained burial. It did not explain why some victims had been stripped of clothing or why microfractures suggested sudden inward compression. The theory survived, but as a weaker strand in the weave. Animal attack and interpersonal violence drifted further toward the margins. There were no teeth marks, no signs of struggle beyond what panic and cold could produce. The brutality some imagined did not align with the pattern of injuries or the distribution of effects. These explanations felt human-sized and tidy. The evidence refused them. Infrasound and panic, once a fringe idea, gained traction. Acoustic models and the reconstructed pulse from the dossier produced a plausible physiological effect, a low-frequency hum that can provoke disorientation and terror in humans. Witnesses remembered a hum. The lab's biomechanical analyses matched the sort of internal damage a transient pressure anomaly might cause. Infrasound could trigger flight and paradoxical undressing without needing a physical shove. Circumstantial pieces gathered like magnets. Military testing, quietly noted in redacted logs, shifted from rumor to credible candidate. The shard's metallurgy implied manufacture. Timestamps in the dossier overlapped with the critical 6-minute window on the reconstructed timeline. Radiological traces were faint, but suggestive of proximity to technical equipment. When circumstantial documents and physical fragments lean the same way, a previously speculative theory hardens. Secret weaponry and engineered pulses, the language of conspiracy, found a new, sober tone. The evidence did not demand exotic explanations, but it did point to manufactured influence, a deliberate acoustic or pressure device, an authorized test that produced an unintended human catastrophe. This hybrid theory braided the plausible with the engineered, not a supernatural agent, but technology misapplied in a wild place. Supernatural explanations, for all their dramatic pull, shrank under the light of lab assays and models. They remained useful as metaphor and myth, but less useful as forensic argument. In the end, the team proposed a tempered hybrid, a manufactured acoustic pressure event, a test or device, created a localized aerodynamic anomaly. The impulse produced sudden internal compression in some, disorientation in others, and an instinctive, catastrophic flight into freezing night. Hypothermia and paradoxical undressing finished the narrative the mountain began. They presented it in a small room, voices low. The dossier spread like evidence and possibility. The climax was not a torturing verdict, but a moral reckoning. The past had been altered by human technology, perhaps unintentionally, and the people who had touched it left a silence that now demanded explanation. The prediction that followed was quiet and unnerving. As we translate rumor into models and fragments into facts, our theories sharpen. And with that clarity comes the responsibility to ask who had the means to make the mountain speak and whether any authority will answer. They had expected gaps. Every archive does. What unsettled them was how many of the gaps were sharpened into contradictions, as if the past were not missing pieces, but pieces cut to mislead. In the cool light of the lab they laid them out, the bruises that refused the tidy explanations, the way clothing had been abandoned or removed in mismatched degrees, the faint isotopic traces that read like a technical aftertaste. Each anomaly was a bright, stubborn pebble on the map of that night. Together they made a terrain that did not want to be traversed. Bruising told two stories at once. Superficial impact marks suggested a scramble, collisions with stones or each other in the dark. Deeper, Concentric internal damage suggested a force delivered from within or a compressive wave that left little external mark. Pathologists argued in low voices. Could panic and falls explain both? The models said no, or at least not easily. The injuries implied a suddenness and direction that made an accidental tumble feel like an inadequate actor. Clothing created its own riddle. Paradoxical undressing could account for some victims in autonomic misfire and hypothermia, but in several cases garments were cut away, sometimes left neatly folded, sometimes missing entirely. Why would some remove boots and shirts in haste while others were bundled, face down in the snow? The pattern suggested not uniform confusion, but differing responses to a stimulus: fear, disorientation, deliberate removal, or perhaps an external influence that changed behavior in ways not yet understood. Radiological and chemical anomalies whispered rather than declared. Assays returned values that were not dramatic enough to announce contamination, but odd enough to demand explanation. Trace isotopes and alloy residues hinted at proximity to human-made devices, not evidence of a conspiracy so much as fingerprints of technology in a wilderness. Chain of custody questions shadowed the numbers. Contamination could not be ruled out, yet the distribution of traces refused simple dismissal. Motive, the most human of gaps, yawned under the technical fragments. If the catastrophe was the byproduct of testing, why here and then? If it was an experiment, who authorized it, and why were records redacted or lost? If the event was accidental, why do elements of the scene read like choreography? No ledger explained the presence of the shard, the glint in the photograph, the hush in witness testimony. At the edge of their reconstruction, the team found the most dangerous contradiction: clarity and ambiguity braided together. The more precise their models became, the more specific the questions grew. A 6-minute interval could be drawn with uncanny consistency, and within it were acts that suggested agency, error, and misfortune intertwined. They closed the files and stepped outside into a night that felt thinner than memory. Above, the ridge kept its silence as if it had learned to answer only in fragments. Their prediction, sober and soft-spoken, was that the case would yield no tidy ending. For every answer they sharpened, another contradiction would appear, and the mystery would persist not because evidence was absent, but because the past, when pried open with modern tools, offered new doors that led inward. They slid the folded pamphlet across the diner table like a small, sleeping thing, thin paper, no return address, a single name scrawled in the corner, for the watchers. The voice that had delivered it vanished before dawn. By noon the city hummed with the rumor. By evening, I had the pamphlet under my lamp, the predictions inked in a careful, almost clinical hand. Each prediction read like a bone, stark, inevitable. A river that will remember the names of the drowned. A city's clock that will stop for 1 minute, and something would shift. I felt the cold prickle of narrative, a prophecy begging to be made into a story. But I am a writer, not a prophet. My work is to ask where the paper came from, and what the paper cannot tell. Sources appeared like runes, an anonymous envelope, a nurse who swore she saw the delivery, a grainy security camera that cut out for exactly 30 seconds the night before. A retired archivist offered to test the ink. A forensic linguist volunteered a reading of the idioms. Each expert leaned with their own gravity, each came with a bias. The archivist's decades with paper made him defer to physical age. The linguist's conviction in pattern saw prophecy where a cryptic metaphor might be. The nurse's testimony, sincere, carried the well-known fragility of human memory. Chain of custody, ragged. The pamphlet passed through 3 hands before it reached me, each transfer an opportunity for tampering, for the insertion of narrative into fact. I catalogued the evidence with the same steadiness as a surgeon charts wounds. Source, credibility, motivation, anonymous courier, low credibility but plausible motive attention. Security footage, partial, medium credibility, but subject to editing. Expert commentary, high methodical credibility, yet tinted by intellectual appetite. The new material reshaped the map only slightly. No single piece toppled the old picture. Instead, they reframed the margins, widened doubt, sharpened a question: what if the true prophecy is not prediction at all, but a provocation? Night of the supposed clock stoppage arrived. The city held its breath. People lined streets, eyes up. At 11:59 the minute passed as any other. A cold rain began, then the electricity flickered and 100,000 phone screens filled with a single, sudden image, the pamphlet's title, glowing on a stranger's feed. The moment was less supernatural than theatrical, less revelation than invitation. In the aftermath, I sat with the experts again. Their verdict was careful. The pamphlet did not prove destiny. It revealed instead the human appetite for pattern. It changed the picture not by confirming prophecy, but by demonstrating how stories, once released, become sources themselves, unreliable, contagious, and necessary. I closed my notebook. The climax had not been fire or flood, but the city turning a rumor into an ecology of belief. Somewhere, someone was already writing the next prediction. The chain of custody remained broken, and with it, the last line between truth and performance. They found the slim pamphlet folded into the brass mailbox behind the theater, its corners softened by rain. No return address, only 3 lines on the front: read before dawn. Whoever left it had taken the rest of themselves with them. The first pages were quiet, written like instructions rather than prophecy. Small things: a bench that would face the wrong way, a street lamp that would blink twice, a pigeon that would land on the mayor's shoulder, each paired with a single sentence: listen, remember, decide. The final page carried a prediction that felt too loud to be private. On a night this month, the city's main clock would stop for exactly 60 seconds, and when it restarted, someone would know a truth they had not known before. People mocked it, then argued about it, then began to watch. Cameras were trained, volunteers stood with stopwatches, conspiracy blogs spun maps. The pamphlet sank into the city like a stone into a pond. Ripples from one distracted corner reached another. The narrator, a reporter who thought himself cynical, followed the trail because other stories died in his notebook if he did not feed them. He interviewed the woman who found the pamphlet, a stagehand who swore someone slipped it under the door between shows. He traced the paper to a print shop that had closed last year, a dead end, and he listened to an old clockmaker who measured time with the patience of grief. The more he learned, the less certain he felt. The pamphlet supplied pattern and left motive blank. On the appointed night, the city leaned forward. Street vendors folded their umbrellas. Teenagers went quiet. Commuters stood waiting at crossings. The bell at the square chimed 11. At 11:59, a hush gathered, not the thin silence of waiting, but the dense kind that presses into the bones. The clock halted. For 60 seconds, the city was a single exhale. People spoke names they had never said aloud, a daughter's childhood nickname, the exact wording of a buried apology, an unmade call. Phones lit with old messages. A man in a bar quietly whispered the name of the person he'd loved and lost. A clerk in a laundromat folded a shirt and felt an answer arrive like cool water. Nothing miraculous fell from the sky. No lights burned wholly. Instead, an ordinary pause unlocked something private and human. When the second hand moved again, the world resumed, but the pause had rearranged people like a hand shifting pieces on a board. Some called it magic, others called it mass suggestion. The reporter wrote neither word. He wrote instead about what followed. The city, unsettled, became kinder in small ways, braver in decisions that had been postponed. Rumors multiplied. Someone said the pamphlet had been a social experiment. Others swore a stranger had walked the streets whispering prompts. No proof ever appeared. In the weeks after, the pamphlet's predictions circulated and faded like chalk on rain-slick stone. The climax had not been an event, but an opening, a breath that loosened the tightness around people's throats. Whatever the pamphlet was, prank, art, or something more obscure, it did not change the past. It only offered the city a clean, terrible minute in which to choose, and for reasons neither wholly rational nor wholly belief, many chose differently. Prologue. The hook. They found the sealed envelope at dawn, tucked beneath the cracked stone of the old clock tower. No stamp, no name, only a single sentence folded across thin linen paper. At 60 seconds, tell the truth you have hidden longest. By evening, the town was watching its clock like a patient monitors a dying heart. Historical context. This town kept its history in small, stubborn rituals. Every 50 years someone predicted upheaval. A pamphlet in 1869 that coincided with a factory strike, a painted symbol in 1924 before a mayoral scandal, rumors that had hardened into local lore. Skeptics called it folklore. Believers called it warning. The clock tower was the spine of those stories, a silent witness to patterns the town refused to forget. Presentation of new evidence. The envelope contained 3 items: the linen page, a precise list of small occurrences, a lamp that would miss a line, a dog that would howl twice, and a single photograph, grainy, showing a figure in the tower's shadow. The photograph's margins bore tiny smudges of ink. Its chain of custody was messy, found by a night janitor, handed to a theater stage manager, and then to the reporter who told the town. Each transfer left possibilities for addition or alteration. Expert analysis. Dr. Marin Kessler, a forensic linguist, mapped idioms and syntax to a regional dialect last common in the 1930s. Henry Cole, a retired paper conservator, dated the linen to modern manufacture but noted aging techniques that could be simulated. Their methods were rigorous, but not neutral. Kessler favored pattern recognition and saw intention. Cole's years among fragile artifacts made him distrustful of anything newly presented. Both cautioned about confirmation bias, how knowing the prediction changes what people notice. Competing theories. Residents split. One faction argued for artful social engineering, a prank designed to measure mass suggestion. Another suspected a political gambit to unsettle an upcoming election. A third, quieter group embraced the possibility of something more mysterious, a ritualized message meant to prod conscience. Each theory had motives and gaps. None fit the evidence perfectly. Dramatic reconstruction. On the appointed night, the clock stuttered at 11:59. For 60 seconds, the town held still. In pockets, laundromats, bars, hospital corridors, names were whispered, old apologies spoken aloud, confessions that had rotated inside chests for years. Nothing supernatural thundered forth. The pause was ordinary, intimate, catalytic. A woman left her husband a letter. A teacher resigned from fear no longer masked by routine. Cameras recorded faces, not miracles. Open but shifted conclusion. The experts agreed on one thing. The pamphlet did not prove a prophecy. Its provenance was unclear, its physical traces ambiguous. Yet the episode altered the town as surely as any verified event, not by confirming fate, but by opening a fissure through which choice spilled. Whether engineered or inspired, the minute had become testimony. Sometimes the most compelling evidence is not a document's origin, but the way people reshape themselves around a story. The map arrived folded inside a brittle envelope, corners stained with salt and a smear of something like gold ink. It was not the map that caught everyone's eye, but the note tucked beneath it, a single line written in a hand that trembled and then grew steadier. Listen to the minute. It will tell you who you have been hiding from yourself. That sentence was the prologue everyone played on repeat. They laid out the map on the newsroom table beneath a lamp whose bulb hummed like a distant generator. The map itself was a patchwork, the old shoreline inked in brown, the newer ring road penciled over in blue, a tiny red X at the clock tower. Beside it, a faded timeline glued to a board, pamphlets and painted symbols from 1869, 1924, 1978, archival footage grainy with the crackle of film, the mayor in a wool coat, protests folding into the square like origami. The timeline breathed history into the present. The map rooted the rumor in place. Sound design became our lingua franca. We sampled wine through the tower's louvers, a low whale song moan, the howling of late trains, the crunch of winter snow under boots, each cut spliced into a reel to make the town itself speak. Haunting photographs surfaced, a black and white of the tower at dusk, a silhouette in the bell's shadow. Archival footage showed a street lamp flickering twice before a blackout that had marked a scandal in 1924. Personal letters arrived too, a packet of correspondence between lovers. The ink faded but the ache stark. One letter, dated only by smell and sentiment, read, "If there is 1 minute to tell it, then tell it when the clock stops, and our wrongs might be lightened." New evidence arrived by way of a night janitor, a clipped cassette marked "Listen, 11:59." The chain of custody was thin. The tape had passed hands, curious, careless, and that made experts cautious. Dr. Hoffel, a sound archivist, measured hiss and splice and concluded the recording was authentic in timing but ambiguous in origin. A conservator dated the paper to recent manufacture. Their measured voices returned us to center. Plausible, but not proof. On the night the clock faltered, the town soundscape collapsed into a single, pregnant silence. For 60 seconds, air seemed to hold its weight. A dryer in a laundromat clicked off mid-cycle. A dog 3 streets over began to howl and then stopped. People spoke names they had not spoken aloud in years. Phones recorded nothing supernatural, only breaths, a whimper, a letter unfolded on a kitchen table, and the quiet suction of someone finally saying "I am sorry." When the second hand resumed its march, nothing had been finished. But the minute left marks, small reconciliations, resigned resignations, a child given a name. The photographs and tapes did not prove fate. They proved something else, that a town, fed by maps and timelines, by sound and photograph and a single trembling letter, could be nudged toward honesty. The final frame was not clarity, but a shifted view. Evidence remained imperfect, provenance uncertain, yet the human landscape had changed, quieter and oddly more true. They called it the last warning, a folded page found nailed beneath the weather vane of the research outpost the winter before the avalanche. It read like a ledger of small inevitabilities, a goal that circles twice, a morning when the radio goes dead, a line of ice that will creep like a bruise along the ridge. The note was not prophetic in the luminous sense. It was procedural, clinical, the kind of thing a meticulous person writes when they are afraid and know the science of what might happen. When the snow came down, the ridge let go. 8 people were buried under a night that tasted like iron and graphite. The government investigation closed quickly. Structural failure, a confluence of weather and human error. Official reports ended with diagrams and bullet points. The town stitched the loss into its calendar and learned to speak of it in measured syllables. But the note persisted, passed between mittens and drawers, its handwriting a fragile ember against the cold. Out here, myths do not need miraculous proof. They only need a seam of truth and enough time to fray into story. I returned 10 years later to interview survivors and comb through the quiet the commissioners had left behind. The landscape was a ledger of absence, wind hollowing the same gullies, footprints erased overnight. People told me the note had been found by a young technician who would later bury his own son in the same cemetery. They showed me the cassette tapes of radio static, the photos of the ridge with a thin white hairline where the ice had parted. They also showed me anger at investigators who brought maps but left no reckonings, at the way science had been folded into shorthand and then shelved. Experts came and explained the limits, models that could not account for sudden shear, instrumentation damaged by cold, chains of custody broken by necessity when bodies needed to be recovered. Their conclusions were sober and partial, uncertainty lived in their footnotes. And where official methods stopped, a different human method began, storytelling. Around stoves and at wakes, people embroidered the warning into a more capacious thing, a moral test about hubris, a ritual about listening. The climax was not cinematic, no last-minute rescue or revelatory confession, but it was devastatingly intimate. In a recreated night, the survivors spoke names into a recorder, the man who should have checked the cornice, The woman who had written the note and then vanished, the child who had asked a question about the sound the ridge made before it collapsed. Their voices trembled like thin ice. The note had not caused the avalanche. At most it had amplified attention, sharpened where people looked. But attention in those conditions can be a life or death instrument. I left with the notebook half full of measurements and a head full of quieter things. How extreme environments reveal the edges of human control. How investigative certainty stops where grief begins, and how myths form not to deceive, but to hold small communities upright between cold facts. Reopening the wound had been ethically fraught. Some thanked me, others closed their doors, and the town remained divided. The real evidence, if any existed, was less about blame than about what a community chooses to remember. The note endured, ambiguous and human, a small artifact that asked a larger question. When the world narrows to survival, what else are we willing to risk by asking why? They called it the minute, a brittle sheet folded into a library book, its edges thumbed as if someone had read it on a train and then put it away. The predictions inside were small and surgical: a street lamp that would blink twice, a dog that would howl at midnight, and, most precise of all, a town clock that would stop for exactly 60 seconds. Whoever wrote it did not promise miracles. They promised attention. On the night the clock faltered, the town went quiet as a held breath. In that suspended minute people spoke truths they had carried like small stones, apologies, names, decisions they had delayed. No thunderbolt came, no cosmic vindication. The effect was human and immediate. The pamphlet had not forced anything. It had only created a space where people could choose differently. After the minute, the evidence moved into hands with different kinds of weight. A conservator tested the paper. A linguist mapped the dialect of the phrasing. An archivist traced the pamphlet's physical path through libraries and lost drawers. Each test nudged the story, but did not settle it. The chain of custody was ragged. 3 documented transfers, to unrecorded hands, a gap where a scrapbook and a cigarette lighter were the only witnesses. Experts agreed the document could be produced recently, other signals leaned older. In short, the pamphlet was convincing in effect, but ambiguous in origin. What convincingly changed was human behavior. Where there had been apathy, there was conversation. Where there had been postponed choices, there were phone calls and folded letters left on kitchen tables. The town's emotional topology was altered, not by proof of prophecy, but by a communal minute that made private truths public. That shift is real, measurable in small reconciliations, resignations, and the odd, bracing generosity that followed. What remains unknown is more consequential: who authored the pamphlet and why, whether the pause was orchestrated or emergent, and how far the document was altered in transit. The physical test returned probabilities, not answers. Witness statements contradicted one another. Motive remains opaque. If this story is to move beyond rumor, 2 things must happen. First, rigorous, transparent testing, fiber and ink analysis, audio forensics on the recordings made that night, and full documentation of the chain of custody with sworn statements. Second, archival and oral history work, search local press archives, revisit personal scrapbooks, and convene public interviews with those who handled the pamphlet. An independent review board should be appointed to ensure impartiality and to recommend whether officials should reopen any related inquiries. The minute did not answer fate. It asked a question: what do we do when a document reshapes a community? The ethical choice is clear: preserve what we can, investigate what we must, and, above all, let the town keep the small, hard truths it chose to speak in that suspended minute.